Ma'am, I'm going to say this slow so it lands. There is no record of you. None. So whatever you think that little pin makes you, you are going to take it off before somebody sees it and gets the wrong idea." The young man behind the security desk said it loud enough for the whole lobby to hear, and he wanted it that way. His name tape read Nolan. He was 25 years old, a master-at-arms second class, and he had a badge on his belt and a computer that told him who was real and who was not, and the computer had told him nothing at all about the old woman in the red cardigan sitting 3 feet away. She did not look up. She sat with her appointment slip squared flat on her knee, both hands folded over it, and she looked at the paper the way a person looks at something they have already read and do not need to read again. Her hair was white and pinned back in a plain way. Her cardigan was a soft, worn red, the kind a person keeps for years because it fits. On the left side, near the collarbone, there was a small pin, tarnished almost to gray, no bigger than a thumbnail. The clinic was a Naval veterans medical facility on a gray weekday morning, and it smelled of floor wax and coffee that had been sitting too long. Rows of chairs, old men with canes, a television bolted high on the wall playing the weather to no one. Behind the sign-in counter, a volunteer in a gray vest had gone still with a clipboard in his hand. She had come in at 8 o'clock when the doors unlocked, the way people come to these places when they have learned that the morning is the only part of the day that runs on time. She had signed the book in a small, square hand. She had taken the chair nearest the door and farthest from the television, and she had waited, and she had bothered no one. And if the young man at the security desk had left her alone, she would have been seen by 10 and home by noon, and no one in that lobby would ever have learned a single thing about her. That was how she had planned it. That was how she planned everything. To be unremarkable was not a failure of hers. It was a discipline she had spent 50 years perfecting, and she was very good at it. And it had worked on everyone in that room but 2 old men. Nolan keyed her name a second time and got the same blank screen, and he leaned back in his chair as though the screen had confirmed something about her rather than about his system. "You hearing me?" he said. "I need that pin, and I need you to understand that impersonating a service member is not a small thing. That is federal." The old woman turned the slip a quarter turn on her knee, so its edge lined up with the seam of her trousers. When she spoke, her voice was low and even, and it carried without her raising it. "Try the paper file," she said. "Second cabinet, the ones that don't scan." She said it the way a person reads a bearing off a compass, flat. Certain. A fact offered without weight. Take it or leave it. A young corpsman standing near the counter, a kid, maybe 20, a chart pressed to his chest, looked at the second cabinet against the wall, and then looked at Nolan. Nolan laughed. It was a short laugh, meant for the room. "The paper files," he said, "are for real veterans, not for whoever wandered in off the parking lot today." He tapped the counter with 2 fingers. "Pin, now, or we do this the other way." The old woman set the slip flat again and folded her hands over it and did not move. And it was the not moving that the volunteer in the gray vest could not stop watching. He had spent 30 years around men who had done the quiet work, and he knew that particular stillness when he saw it. The stillness of someone who has already decided that nothing in this room can hurt them, and is simply waiting to see how long it takes everyone else to figure that out. Nolan leaned over the counter, certain he had caught something, and the old woman lifted her eyes and looked at him for the first time, and the young corpsman with the chart took 1 step back without knowing why. "So-called unit," Nolan said, drawing the words out. "Go ahead. Give me the unit you were supposedly in. I'll wait." The old woman gave him a designation, then a date. Both in clipped order, the letters and the numbers set down like items on a manifest. No explanation, no plea, no softening. The letters meant nothing to Nolan, To him, they were noise, and noise was proof, because a person telling the truth would have said something he recognized. He shook his head and half smiled at the screen, the smile of a man who has heard every story and believes none of them. And he did not notice that the smile was the only thing in the room that still belonged to the version of the morning he thought he was in. The letters stopped the man in the gray vest where he stood. His name was Hal Merrick. He was 66 years old, a retired senior chief hospital corpsman, and he volunteered here 3 mornings a week because his wife had told him he was no good sitting still. He had heard a lot of men and women read off units in this lobby. He had never heard anyone read off that one. His eyes went to the pin at her collar, small, tarnished, the kind of thing that is not sold in any gift shop and is not made anymore. And then to her feet, where one shoe stayed flat and squared to the door while the rest of her rested. Merrick knew that too. You sat where you could see the entrance. You did not stop doing it just because 50 years had gone by. The men he had known who had done the real work never sat with their backs to a door for the rest of their lives, and they never talked about why, and if you asked them, they would look at you the way the old woman was not looking at Nolan now, as if the question were beneath answering, and the answer were none of your affair. He had carried men off of helicopters with their insides in his hands. He had held a pressure dressing on a chest for 6 miles of bad road with his knee, and he had lost some and kept some. And in 30 years of it, he had learned to read a body the way other men read a page. And everything about the way this old woman sat, the squared foot, the folded hands, the way her eyes had gone once to the exits and the coffee cart and the 2 doors, and come to rest and never twitched again, told him that whoever she was not lost, she was not confused, and she was not, whatever the computer said, a fraud. Frauds fidgeted. Frauds performed. This woman was doing the one thing a fraud can never do, which is nothing at all. Nolan waved a hand at the screen. "That's not a real designation," he said. "That's alphabet soup. You people always pick the ones nobody can check." A woman 2 seats down offered the old veteran the empty chair beside her, closer, softer. The old veteran shook her head, once, politely, and stayed where she was, where the door was in her sight line. Merrick set his clipboard on the counter and began to cross the lobby. The volunteer's smile he wore 3 mornings a week was gone. And for the first time that morning, Nolan was not the only person in the room walking like he had authority. Nolan saw him coming and read it wrong. He turned back to a co-worker who had drifted over from the far desk, and he pitched his voice up for the room. "We got a live one," he said. "Thinks she's a frog man." A ripple of nervous laughter went around the near chairs. Not everyone, but enough. The kind of laughter people give when they are relieved the trouble belongs to someone else. The co-worker, a heavy-set contractor named Deal, who worked the far desk, and did not want any part of this, gave a small laugh and edged back toward his own post, because he had been doing this job long enough to know that the loud ones were the ones you did not stand next to. Nolan did not notice him leave. Nolan had found his audience in the chairs, and an audience was oxygen to him, and he leaned into it. "No, I mean it," he said, spreading his hands, playing the room. "You should see some of the ones we get. Everybody was a hero. Everybody was in the thick of it. Everybody's got a story and a pin and no paperwork." He looked back at the old woman, as if she were the punchline he had been building toward. "And every single one of them picks a unit you can't check. Funny how that works." The old woman let him talk. She had been talked over by louder and more dangerous men than this one, in worse rooms, and she had learned that the talking always ran out before the truth did, if you were patient, and she had nothing in the whole world if not patience. "Come on," Nolan said, turning back to her, warming to the audience now. "Hand me the pin. Before this becomes a whole thing. You take it off yourself, We forget it ever happened. You go home." The old woman closed her fingers around the pin once, not to protect it, just a small, private motion, the way a person touches a thing to be sure it is still there. Then she rested her hand again on the slip. Merrick reached the counter. He did not raise his voice either. "Son," he said, "walk this back. You do not want to be standing where you're standing in 5 minutes." Nolan didn't even look at him. "Sit down, Pops." An older man 3 chairs down, a veteran, ball cap, tight jaw, watched the whole thing with his hands flat on his knees and said nothing, because in a room with a badge and a computer, the badge and the computer decide who is real, and he had learned a long time ago that arguing with them cost you your afternoon. So the old woman sat and did not move, and the lobby settled comfortably into the story that she was a joke. Everyone but the 2 old men who had gone very still. If you have ever watched the young forget what the old once carried into the dark and brought back out, stay with this one to the end, and subscribe to the Veteran Vault, because the next forgotten legend is waiting on a bench somewhere just like this. Nolan stood up from his chair. That was the moment it stopped being talk. He came around the end of the counter and put himself between the old woman and the intake window, so that the path to the appointment she had come for now ran through him. "You're not being seen today," he said. "You're being processed." He said it with satisfaction, the way a man says a phrase he has been waiting all morning to use. "Stolen valor," he went on, ticking it off on his fingers for the benefit of the chairs. "Impersonating a service member. False claim on a federal facility. You're facing serious time, old lady. You should have thought about that before you decided to play dress-up on a Tuesday." The word "processed" hung in the air. A clinic is a place people come to be helped. He had turned it, in one sentence, into a place she was being held. He keyed his radio and called it up the chain in the bored official cadence of a man reporting a delivery. Possible impersonation. Front lobby. Requesting a supervisor. He read out a code for it, a number that meant fraud in the language of his job, and he read it the way a man reads a lottery ticket he already knows is a winner. He had caught something today. That was the story he was telling himself, and he told it well, because he told it to himself first. He did not know, how could he, that the codes and the radios and the badge on his belt were the smallest authority in that lobby, by an order of magnitude no computer in the building could measure. He believed that the systems made a person real. He had never once in his 25 years met the kind of person whose realness had been sealed in a folder, precisely so that people like him would never find it. He was about to. Across the room, against the far wall, Hal Merrick took out an old flip phone and made a call of his own. He did not call a supervisor. He dialed a number he had carried in the same worn place in his wallet for 50 years, the number of a man he had served beside once, a long time ago, who had told him, the last time they spoke, that if Merrick ever saw a certain pin on a certain kind of person and saw that person in trouble, he was to call, day or night, and say only where. Merrick said where. Then he closed the phone and put his back to the wall and waited. The way you wait for weather, you can already smell coming. The young corpsman, Micah Ford, stepped in. He had the paper ledger from the second cabinet open in his hands. He had pulled it while no one was watching, because she had said second cabinet, and she had been right. "Nolan," Ford said. Quiet. Urgent. Man. She gave the right cabinet. She knew the filing. Just let me look. Give me 2 minutes. "Stand down, Ford," Nolan said without turning. "You want to be part of this? Because I can make you part of this." Ford closed his mouth. He did not put the ledger back. And Nolan reached out and set his hand on the old woman's arm to bring her up out of the chair. The lobby held its breath. Merrick pushed off the wall and crossed the last of the distance to the desk, and this time he did not ask. "That pin," Merrick said, "that you keep pointing at like it's a toy. I have seen exactly one of those in my whole life. It was on a man who never once told me where he got it, because he wasn't allowed to, and because the getting of it cost him things he didn't talk about either." He looked at Nolan's hand on the old woman's arm. "Take your hand off her. Now." Nolan hesitated. His hand did not move, but it did not tighten either. Merrick leaned in, and he said one word, quietly, and he said it not to Nolan, but to the old woman, watching her face, not the young man's. "Blackjack." The old woman did not confirm it. Her expression did not change at all, but her eyes moved, once, from the paper on her knee to the old volunteer's face, and they held there a half-second longer than a stranger's eyes would have, and that was all the confirmation Hal Merrick had ever needed from anyone about anything. A half-second. 50 years. It was enough. He had been carrying that word in his mouth for most of his life. The man who had told it to him in a hospital tent that no longer existed on a map, that no longer named that country the same way, had said it once and made him repeat it back, and then told him to forget he had ever heard it, unless he ever saw the pin. Unless he ever saw the person wearing the pin in trouble. Then he was to remember it, and say it, and make the call. Merrick had gone 30-some years never expecting the day to come. And here it was, on a gray Tuesday, in a clinic that smelled of floor wax, and he found that his voice had not shaken when he said it, and he was glad of that, obscurely and deeply glad, as if he had passed a test set for him a long time ago by a man now dead. She did not have to confirm it. 2 chairs down, the older veteran in the ball cap stood up. He did it slowly, the way a man stands when his knees are old, but he stood all the way up, and he turned to face the desk. A moment later, across the aisle, a second man stood too. Nobody had told them anything. They had simply watched the volunteer say a word to an old woman in a red cardigan, and watched her not deny it, and something in the room had shifted under them like a deck coming level. Nolan felt it and hated it, and did the thing that frightened men do, which is double down to keep from drowning. "I don't care what fairy tale you two cooked up," he said, but his voice had thinned, and everyone could hear that it had. What the young man in the pressed uniform did not know, what he could not have known, standing there with his hand still resting on her arm, was who was already out in the parking lot, walking toward those doors. Stay with it. And if a channel that remembers the forgotten is worth something to you, subscribe to the Veteran Vault so the next one finds you. The black water of the river did not reflect the moon, because there was no moon, and that was the whole point of the night. 1969, the Mekong Delta. She was 23 years old. The country had a way of deciding, in those years, that certain work simply was not being done, and then finding people to do it anyway, quietly, and leaving their names off of everything. She had been one of those people. She was not supposed to have been there at all, by the rules the country wrote down and showed to itself. But the rules a country writes down and the work a country needs done in the dark are 2 different things, and she had lived, for a handful of years, in the space between them, trained in the water and the dark and the small boats, sent where the maps had no useful names, and told, always, that if it went wrong there would be no one coming, and no record that she had gone. She had made her peace with all of it young. You did, or you did not last. The part she had never made her peace with, the part she carried out of that space between the rules and never set down, had a name, and the name was Wesley Poole. That night, the team was compromised before it began. They knew it the way you know weather, a wrongness in the quiet. Birds that should have called and did not. A sampan on the far bank that sat too long and too still. The right call would have been to turn the boats around and go home with nothing and be alive to try again. But there was a patrol on the far bank that had gone in 2 nights before and had not come out clean, and one of them was down in the reeds, and the difference between a rescue and a recovery was measured that night in minutes and in flares. She went into the water off the low side of the boat without a splash, because a splash carried, and the far bank was close enough that a splash could get a man killed. The current pulled at her legs. The cold was not the enemy. The cold was almost a friend, because it kept you sharp. The enemy was the light, the flares that hung and drifted and turned the black water briefly to pewter, and in that pewter light, anything moving died. There was a man down on the far bank, a boy, really. 17 years old, a new sailor named Ordway, who had lied about his age to enlist and had not yet learned how to be afraid quietly. He was hit in the leg and pinned in the reeds, and the boats could not close the distance without going into the light, and if they waited for the light to stop, he would be gone before it did. So she went for him. That was the work. It did not have a speech attached. She crossed the open water low, timing herself to the dark between the flares, and she reached the reeds and found the boy and put her hand flat on his chest and pressed once, hard, which was the signal they had drilled. I am here. Be still. And she felt him understand it and go quiet under her hand. She talked to him in a whisper that was mostly breath. She told him he was going to hate the swim and love the boat, and that all he had to do was hold on to her rig and stop kicking, because his kicking would drown them both. She got him into the water. She got an arm across him. She started back. He was heavier than a boy his size had any right to be, the way the wounded always are, because fear has a weight of its own, and he was carrying a great deal of it. She kept her mouth close to his ear and kept the words coming, low and steady, and meaning almost nothing. You're doing fine. Hold the rig. Don't kick. We're closer than we are. Don't kick. Because the words were a rope, and as long as she kept paying out the rope, he would hold on to it. And a man who is holding on to something does not thrash. And a man who does not thrash does not die in the last 20 meters, which is where they nearly all die. The dark between the flares was a country you learned to live in. When the flare hung, you were a stone in the water. Nothing. Dead matter drifting. And you did not move a muscle no matter what your body screamed at you, because movement in that pewter light was the last decision a person got to make. When the dark came back down, you swam, fast and flat, spending the darkness like coin, and when the next flare popped, you were a stone again. She had done it so many times that her body did it now without her, and the part of her that was still thinking was free to do the arithmetic, the cold arithmetic she would carry the rest of her life. How far the boat, how many seconds of dark, how many men still on the bank, and which of them the seconds would reach. Her swim buddy, Wesley Poole, was 22 years old, a boatswain's mate, and he was the best waterman she ever knew, better than her. And he told her so often, and she'd let him, because it was true. When she went for the boy, Poole went for the last man on the bank, the one who could not walk at all. She heard the flare pop. She felt the water go pewter around her. She did not look back, because looking back would have cost the boy on her arm the 2 seconds it took to reach the shadow of the hull, and she had already decided, in the cold and the dark, which 2 seconds she was spending, and on whom. Wesley Poole did not come out of the water. They pulled the boy Ordway over the gunwale, and he was screaming and alive, and she went back under the boat and along the far side, and into the reeds one more time in the dark, and there was nothing there to bring back but the current. She stayed in that water until the light came, going along the hull and into the reeds, and back, 3 times. 4. until the coxswain finally reached down and took a fistful of her collar and told her, in a voice that was not unkind, that there was nothing left to go back for, and she was going to make it 2 names instead of 1. She let him pull her aboard. It was the only order she took all night that she had not given herself. At dawn, she sat on the steel deck with her back against the coaming and kept one hand flat on the boy's chest, over the bandage, feeling him breathe, counting it, because the counting was the only thing that would hold her together, and she knew it. He kept trying to talk. He wanted to know her name, wanted to know who she was, wanted to give her something, thanks or a debt or a place to put the enormity of still being alive. She told him to be quiet and breathe. She told him the only thing he owed anybody was to go home and grow old and be worth the trade. She did not tell him about Poole. He would learn that later and carry it, as she did, for the rest of a long life. They gave her a ribbon for that night, later, in a room with the doors closed, and they gave her a folder that would be sealed and never opened, because the where and the how of that river were not things the country was willing to say out loud, then or for a long time after. She kept neither the ribbon nor the folder. She left them where they put them. What she kept was the boy's breathing under her hand, and the name of the man who had traded his place in the world for that breathing, and a small pin she was allowed to wear precisely because no one who saw it would ever know what it meant. The memory closed the way it always closed, on a pin in a young hand, pressed into her palm in a closed room, and on the same pin, decades on, tarnished to gray, resting at the collar of a red cardigan in a clinic lobby, the one thing she had carried out of that black water that she had never, in 50 years, set down. Back in the lobby, the supervisor had not yet arrived, and Nolan could feel the room turning against him, and he could not stand it. He was a young man who had never in his life been the smallest thing in a room, and the room was busy teaching him that he was, and rather than let it, he reached out and took the old woman by the arm a second time, harder now, to bring her up and march her to the door before anyone with rank could arrive and take the moment away from him. She let him. That was the thing not one of them understood, then or later. She let him. There was nothing in that clinic, no badge, no radio, no young man with a grip he thought was strong, that could have moved her 1 inch if she had decided otherwise. She had crossed a river under the flares for a stranger. She was not afraid of a boy's hand on her sleeve. She let him take her arm because she had spent a lifetime learning that the cost of stopping a foolish young man too early was that he never learned anything, and the cost of letting him go a half step too far was only that the half step belonged to him. But when he pulled, her free hand came up and closed, once around his wrist. He stopped as if he had grabbed a mooring cleat. There was no drama in it, no wrench, no twist. Her hand simply closed, and his arm simply stopped, and for 1 full second, the whole lobby saw, in the set of her shoulders and the flat calm of her eyes, exactly what she was and had always been under the soft red wool. Then she opened her hand and let him have his wrist back. "You are going to want your hand back before that door opens," she said, quiet, even, almost kind. "For your sake, not mine." There was no threat in it. That was the thing that unsettled him most later, when he turned the morning over and over in the long nights that came after. That she had not threatened him. A threat he could have argued with. A threat he could have called insubordination, resistance, a reason. She had simply told him a true thing about his own near future in the tone a person uses to mention rain, and then she had let go of his wrist and folded her hands again and gone back to being still, and he had stood there with his hand hanging in the air, feeling, for the first time in his adult life, small. Micah Ford moved to her side and stayed there. Hal Merrick turned to face the doors. Every veteran in the lobby was on his feet now, without a word passing between them, the way men who have stood in formation their whole lives will find the position again the instant the moment calls for it. And the clinic door swung open, and every head in the room but the old woman's turned toward the sound. The man who came through the doors was 74 years old, and he wore the service dress of a vice admiral, and he walked with the particular economy of a man who has spent 50 years learning that he does not need to hurry for a room to wait on him. His name was Clay Ordway. Half a century ago, his name had been the boy on the bank. He walked straight up the center of the lobby. He did not look at the desk. He did not look at Nolan, who had come to a kind of frozen attention without deciding to. He walked past all of it, past the standing veterans and the frozen clerks, and the television murmuring the weather to no one, and he stopped squarely in front of the old woman in the red cardigan. And he did not speak first. He brought his hand up and he saluted her, and he held it. A vice admiral does not hold a salute. A salute is returned and dropped, but he held it, standing in front of an 80-year-old woman in a soft red cardigan, and his jaw was working, and his eyes were bright, and he held it the way you hold the one thing you have waited your entire adult life to be allowed to do in the open. "Master Chief," he said. His voice did not come out steady, and he did not try to make it. It took me 50 years to be allowed to say this in a room with the doors open. Medal of Honor, 1969. He let it land. I am the reason there was a citation at all. I am the boy she went back into the water for. And the man who went back for the last of us and didn't come home traded his place on this earth for mine. And her hand was the last thing that made sense that night. He said her name, then. Her full name, her rank, plainly, into the quiet. He said the citation date again so there could be no mistaking it. And he said the word that a Navy man says perhaps once or twice in a career, if he is very lucky, and never expects to say it to a woman in a red cardigan in a clinic lobby on a Tuesday. He said that she wore the medal, that it had been awarded and sealed and awarded again in the only ceremony the country would allow, behind closed doors, and that he had spent 30 years of rank and every favor he had ever been owed trying to get the right to say it out loud in front of witnesses, and had finally, that morning, been told he could. "Everything I have ever been," he said, and now his voice did break, and he let it in front of all of them, a vice admiral letting his voice break in a clinic lobby. "Every command, every ribbon, every man and woman I ever got to bring home, all of it sits on top of one night when a person the country pretends did not exist decided I was worth the swim. So you will forgive me if I do not much care what your computer says." The room stood up. It did not stand the way a room stands when someone tells it to. It stood the way water finds its level. All at once, from every corner, the old veterans and the young corpsmen and the clerks and the woman who had offered her chair, rising together, and not one of them could have told you afterward exactly when they had started. The older man in the ball cap came to attention first and held it, his old spine finding the line it had held 10,000 times a lifetime ago, and his eyes were wet, and he did not care. Micah Ford set the paper ledger down on the counter with great care, as though it had become a thing that deserved care, and he squared himself and held his shoulders back. Even the co-worker Deal, who had wanted no part of any of it, stood at the far desk with his hands at his sides. They were not standing for the rank. Half of them could not have named the rank. They were standing because the room had spent 20 minutes agreeing that a quiet old woman was nothing, and the room had been wrong, catastrophically and publicly wrong, and standing was the only apology a room can make altogether at once. And Bryce Nolan's face went through the whole of it in the space of a breath. Confusion first, because the words did not fit the morning he thought he was having. Then disbelief, a small shake of the head, a reach for the version of events in which he was still right. Then recognition, as the pieces came down one after another, The pin no computer could find, the paper file she had known by cabinet, the call sign the old volunteer had spoken, the flag officer holding a salute for the woman he had just tried to march to the door. And then, last, horror, pure and cold, as the size of what he had done arrived in him all at once, and there was no chair left in the room that was his to sit down in. The Vice Admiral finally brought the salute down. He took the old woman's hand in both of his, and he bent his head over it. And for a moment, the second highest-ranking man in that entire command was just a man who had been 17 and pinned in the reeds. And she was the reason he had ever gotten to be anything else. And the young master-at-arms stood alone in the middle of a room that was no longer, in any way, his. The reckoning did not take long, because these things, once the truth is standing in the room, never do. Master Chief Boyd Trask came through the doors 90 seconds behind the Vice Admiral, Nolan's own chain of command, 48 years old, a chief master-at-arms who had been doing this work since before Nolan could drive. He took in the whole of it in one slow sweep. The flag officer, the standing room, the old woman, the young man with the color gone out of his face. He did not ask what had happened. He could read it. 30 years of standing watch over other men's worst mornings had taught Boyd Trask to walk into a room and know in one breath who had been wronged and who had done the wronging. And this room was the easiest reading he had done in years. There was an old woman with a flag officer bent over her hand, and there was a whole lobby on its feet, and there was one of his own people standing white and alone by the wall, and the arithmetic of it required no work at all. He crossed to Nolan first. He did not shout. The men who shout, Trask had learned, are the men who are not sure they will be obeyed, and Trask had never once in his career been unsure of that. "Nolan," Trask said. His voice was not loud. It did not have to be. "Off the desk, now. You are relieved. You and I are going to have a very long morning, and it is going to start with you standing at that wall and not saying one more word until I tell you to." Nolan went to the wall. He went the way a man goes when the floor he has stood on his whole life has been pulled out from under him, and he is discovering, in real time, that there was never any floor, only a habit of assuming one. He put his back to the wall where Trask pointed, and he looked at the middle distance, and he did not say a word. And the pressed uniform that had made him feel 10 feet tall an hour ago now hung on him like a costume he had been caught wearing. There would be a review, there would be paperwork, and a board, and a long conversation with Trask that would not be pleasant and would not be quick. But all of that was later, and procedural, and small. The thing that was happening to Bryce Nolan right now, against that wall, was larger than any board could reckon, and it had nothing to do with his career. He was watching a lobby full of strangers stand at attention for a woman he had tried to throw out of it, and he was understanding, for the first time in his life, that the world had been full of people worth more than him the whole time, quietly, without announcing it, and that his entire way of moving through it had been built on never once considering that this might be true. Vice Admiral Ordway turned to the old woman and asked her quietly what she wanted done. It was not a formality. He would have done anything she said, and everyone close enough to hear understood that he meant it. She looked over at the young man against the wall, at the pressed uniform and the badge and the face that had not yet caught up to itself, and she was quiet for a moment. "Nothing," she said. "He's just a boy who never learned to look twice. Somebody teach him how." She paused. "Don't break him doing it. Breaking him is easy. Teaching him is the harder thing, and it's the only thing that's worth anything. Honor the ones who carry it in silence, the ones who cross the water for a stranger and let the country seal the folder and never once ask for the room to stand. If this old woman's kind of quiet is worth remembering, subscribe to the Veteran Vault, and let her story find the people who need to be reminded. Weeks later, there was a wall. It stood in the open air, long and dark and low, and it was cut with names, row on row of them, more than a person could read in a day. The morning was cool and bright, and the wall gave back the light in a soft way. An old woman in a red cardigan stood in front of it, with her fingers resting on one cut name, about shoulder height. The name was Wesley Poole. She did not say anything to it. She had said what she had to say to it a long time ago, and had gone on saying it, quietly, every year since, and did not need to say it louder now. A pace behind her, and a little to the side, a young man stood with his cap in his hands. He was in civilian clothes. He had asked to come. It had taken him 3 tries to ask, and she had said yes on the first because she had meant every word about the harder thing being the only thing worth doing. "I keep trying to figure out what I should have seen," Bryce Nolan said at last to her back. So I never." "You're asking the wrong question," the old woman said without turning. "You won't always be able to see it. Half the time there's nothing to see. That's the whole point of the quiet ones. There's nothing on the outside to tell you." She let her hand come away from the cut name. "So you don't look for the sign. You just decide ahead of time that the person in front of you might have crossed a river you'll never hear about. And you treat every one of them like they did. That's all it is. That's the whole trick. You look twice at everybody, forever, and you never once make them earn it first." The young man was quiet for a long moment, looking at the cut name over her shoulder, at the rows and rows of them going off down the length of the dark stone. More names than a person could hold in a mind at once, each of them once a morning like his, a lobby like his, a person who had crossed some river and been forgotten or remembered by the thin luck of who happened to be standing near them at the end. "I almost put you out that door," he said. It was not quite an apology. It was worse than an apology, and better. It was the truth said plainly, which was the only currency she had ever really respected. "I had my hand on your arm, and you let me. I keep coming back to that. You let me when you could have—" He stopped, because he did not have the words for what she could have done, having only felt the edge of it around his wrist. "I let you," she agreed, "because breaking your arm in that lobby would have taught you exactly nothing, except to be afraid of old women. And the world has enough men who are afraid of the wrong things." She turned then and looked at him, and there was nothing hard in her face. There never had been. That was the thing about her the young man would spend the rest of his life trying to grow into. "Come on," she said. "Walk me to the car. Slow. My knees aren't what they were." And the boy who had once been so sure he could tell the real from the fake with a badge and a computer walked an 80-year-old Medal of Honor recipient across a parking lot at the pace of her knees, carrying nothing, saying nothing, learning the one thing she had crossed a river 50 years ago to be able to teach. Some warriors fade quietly into the years, but the valor never leaves them. Honor the ones who carry it in silence. Thank you for staying and watching. Subscribe to the Veteran Vault for more.